Hello and welcome back to the NESN Patriots podcast. We are coming to you today from the PNC Bank studio over at NESN headquarters. First time we've done an in-studio podcast in like 3 years. I feel like we were talking about Cam Newton last time we were in here doing a Patriots podcast. But today we'll be wrapping up everything that we saw from OTAs and Minicamp and hoping that no breaking DeAndre Hopkins news happens while we are recording this. We're recording this on Thursday morning. The Patriots canceled their final minicamp practice yesterday, and they are off for the summer. But plenty for us to talk about before we begin our summer break. And I think the most obvious place to start has to be with the Patriots offense. It was the biggest storyline going into these spring practices. How is it going to look under new offensive coordinator Bill O'Brien? How is Mac Jones going to look? How is the entire operation going to function? And is it going to be a significant step forward from what the Patriots had last year? Early returns on that unit, I would say pretty positive. Obviously hard to tell anything really based on non-padded, non-full contact practices. But based on everything we've seen so far, it looks so much more like a normal, functional NFL offense. That's a low bar to clear, obviously, but that's a bar that they did not meet for long stretches of last season.
Yeah, I think, this time a year ago when we were watching OTAs and minicamp, I remember when some of those early practices, when I think it was in OTAs, where there were these 7-on-7 periods and Mac Jones was completing bombs to Trey Nixon, to Nelson Aguilar, and we were all like, wow, showing off the improved arm strength you were looking for. Like, you felt good about the offense, but when they got into 11-on-11 periods, they really did struggle. And you didn't think much of it at the time because you're like, they're getting used to the new play caller. It'll be fine in training camp. But you did see a lot of those struggles in the 11-on-11 periods. And then obviously when we got to training camp, it was a disaster. But this year, I think, was a totally different story. I mean, they didn't look like the Kansas City Chiefs out there or anything, but the ball didn't hit the ground very often, which is always a good sign. It just looked cleaner. It looked crisper. There were good vibes a lot of the time, which especially in August last year was not the case. It seemed like everybody was in a bad mood all the time. I think in the final practice on Tuesday, it was clear that the defense was ahead at this point. That was a really good day for the defense. It's the most we've seen the offense struggle, but it still didn't look like the struggles we saw last year. Yeah. So I think all in all, you have to feel positive about what they did during the spring, with the obvious caveat that there were no pads, there was no live contact, so you can't glean too much from it. But definitely a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think Mac Jones used the word normal to describe it after the first open OTA practice, to describe what it's like working with Bill O'Brien. And I think that says a lot just about where this team was and this offense was last year, trying to operate with two guys leading them that really had no experience in doing what they were doing, in Matt Patricia and Joe Judge.
Yeah, there were some not so subtle shots taken at those guys from Mac Jones and from Kendrick Bourne the last couple of weeks.
Mac Jones kind of tiptoed around.
He did the way that what he usually does.
Kendrick Bourne essentially was like, it was a mess last year. It is so much better now. And you mentioned the vibes. The vibes from both of those players were significantly better than what we saw from them last season, where it was just clear that what they were doing offensively was not working. From an offensive line perspective, I think there's still some questions that the Patriots need to answer.
Big questions, I think.
Some big questions, absolutely.
And a receiver.
At offensive tackle, especially with Trent Brown really not doing much of anything this spring. He only attended one of the 5 open practices, and he didn't really do much. He was on the side field doing conditioning work most of that time. But even within that group, you didn't see the blatant communication breakdowns and just kind of free rushers coming in left and right. And it was much more of a cohesive operation. I think any issues that they still have there are going to be kind of personnel and talent based, not really scheme based like was the case last year. I mean, last year they had talent issues and they had scheme issues. When you put both of those together, it's not a good situation. This time, it at least seems like that whole unit's on the same page, which is definitely a step in the right direction there. I think Adrian Clem probably deserves some credit for helping get that group more aligned than they were last year. And again, regardless, it's hard to tell much about offensive linemen or defensive linemen in these practices where you're not wearing pads and you can't have full live contact there in the trenches. But I think that was definitely a positive sign, I would say, going forward in these spring practices.
Yeah, I'm gonna disagree.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they didn't play well or that it didn't look better than it did last year. It certainly did. I have more faith in the group this year than I did last season. But I'm just looking at it saying if they're hitching their wagons to Trent Brown, which has the ability, of course, to be an above average left tackle or right tackle as well. But this contract thing, we don't know if it's a contract thing, but it kind of the tea leaves sort of point in that direction. You always have to worry about his conditioning. I didn't get a good look at him the other day, but some of the reporters who did said he looked not great. But I that's not me. That's just I saw a couple other guys say
I think
that.
the fact that he was at practice and then just kind of immediately left the field and was doing conditioning the
Kinda
entire
tells you what you
time,
need to know.
that kind of tells you that he's either dealing with an injury or the Patriots think he needs to get back in shape.
And so if you don't have Trent Brown, your options are Calvin Anderson, who is a backup tackle, or at least he has been. Riley Reif, who, it seems like he might be a good fit, at least culturally. But also you could argue he's on the back nine of his career. Is he a starting right tackle at this point? And then it's Connor McDermott, who I think emerged as the top right tackle by the end of spring practices. We'll see if that holds out. And then Sidy Sow, I think they're saying, who was drafted, who played guard in college, hasn't played tackle in a while. We heard the Patriots going to try him at tackle. That panned out. They are doing that. But those are your options if Trent Brown can't go. And so I think you can. You mentioned the scheme, and I think that's really important. I think you can scheme around one weakness at tackle. You can make up for that, whether it be the tight end coming in to help. There's various ways you can alleviate that. But if you have two holes at tackle, that's tough.
Yeah.
And so they need Trent Brown to lock down one of those sides, and then you can figure it out of the other one. But if he either can't go, or we've talked about him being a sneaky cut or trade candidate, but then so where do you go after that? Do you bring someone in? I don't know. So I am concerned about that spot. But if everyone shows up and is healthy and plays, I agree with you that it should be a lot better, and it did look a lot better.
Yeah, also not the greatest sign for Riley Reif, who a lot of us projected him as the other starter at that tackle spot opposite Trent Brown.
Especially with the money. Based on the money, that's what he should be.
Based on the money, it's where he should be, and he's been a starter for most of his career. But by the end of spring practice, he was repping more with that second team at left tackle, and Connor McDermott was repping at right tackle opposite Calvin Anderson with that top unit. Obviously, a lot of time for that to change before the season begins, and we don't know exactly what it's going to look like once Trent Brown is in there, assuming he is in there at some point. But not really the kind of ascendant spring that you would hope for from a guy who went into spring practice rather, projecting as a starter.
Yeah, no, I agree. Again, it sounds like, some of the real benefits of him are he's sort of a throwback player. He's tough, really, really good in the locker room. And I think all that's good. And I think you definitely could argue that the Patriots needed more of those kind of guys, kind of throwback Patriots, inserted after kind of the way things went the last 2 years. But if he can't play, then none of that stuff really matters. And he's being paid to be, I think, a starting tackle. So it's tough. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting because the swing tackle spot, who's going to play that? I think in a perfect world, again, you have Trent Brown on the left, Riley Reif, or Connor McDermott on the right, and then Calvin Anderson kind of your swing tackle because he's shown the ability to play both. But right now, all those guys are forced to be playing in different positions, and I don't know how it's going to shake out.
Yeah, I think Trent Brown is probably the biggest X factor on this Patriots team right now. I think if he is in there and playing like 2021 Trent Brown, I think they're in pretty good shape. I think their depth at tackle overall is better than it was last year. I mean, their right tackle situation was just an absolute mess last year between Isaiah Wynn and then having to pick up Marcus Cannon off the street and then having to sign Connor McDermott off of a practice squad. It was just a complete disaster at that position. I think with the top four that they have right now in Brown, Reif, Anderson, and McDermott in some order, I think that's not a terrible setup to have, even though none of those guys are kind of Pro Bowl level players. But if you take Trent Brown out of there, then you're scrambling things a little bit. Then you have three guys that maybe you don't want starting. Two of them are going to be starting. I don't know. That's probably the single biggest kind of thing that the Patriots have to figure out going into camp. Are they going to have Trent Brown? And is he going to be the Trent Brown from 2 years ago? Because Trent Brown last year really wasn't that good. And when he was playing at left tackle, he had a ton of penalties. He let up a ton of sacks. So
I think he was the guy who was negatively impacted by the coaching change the most. Like that's what it felt like to me watching him, is like he looked like he just was not on the same page with anybody.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of it was like a talent decline, so much as it was the scheme wasn't a good one for him, and it looked like he just didn't trust the coaching, which again is a concern with him that you have to worry about going forward.
Yeah.
But I think real quick, we don't want to go too far down the offensive line rabbit hole, but just doing some quick math. I'm trying to remember back to last year. 4 tackles usually were on the roster, right? The 2 starters, and then I think you had Kajust or Marcus Cannon, maybe, and Connor McDermott.
And then late in the year,
you had
after,
2 of them, right?
Yeah.
And then on the interior, you had the 3 starters, and Wenu, Cole Strange, David Andrews, and then you typically had James Ferentz, either Chasen Hines or Bill Murray or someone else as sort of that
Cody
depth
Russi
guard.
was in there.
Cody Russi. And so, that's like 8 guys, maybe?
Yeah.
8 or 9 guys?
It's typically like between 8 and 10 on the roster.
So someone here is going to get squeezed out because right off the bat, you have Trent Brown, Calvin Anderson, Riley Reif, Connor McDermott, Sidney Sal, who's going to make the team, I'd assume so, as a relatively high draft pick, Antonio Maffei, Chasen Hines, David Andrews, Jake Andrews, who was the 3rd-round pick. He's definitely, I think, going to make the team.
4th-round pick. Yeah.
4th-round pick, sorry. Cody Russi, James Ferentz, that's 11. So, and I'm probably forgetting someone. So there's going to be some key players either cut or traded there. And there's not enough spots for everybody. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that group shakes out, not just at the tackle
The 3
spots.
mid-round rookies makes it especially interesting because, I mean, a 4th-round pick you don't want to cut as a rookie. A 5th-round pick you could potentially, but usually those guys, basically everybody drafted before the 6th round is expected to make the team. As a rookie, maybe we see one of those guys end up on injured reserve or on the NFI list or something like that.
Foxborough flu.
Yeah, Maffei was practicing in a red non-contact jersey for part of the spring, so maybe something happens with that. But yeah, there definitely are a lot of bodies in that group that they're going to have to figure out. Let's move on now to another position on the offense. We're going to get to wide receiver in some good depth in a bit, but I think we should touch on the tight ends first because one of the main takeaways from a kind of offensive system scheme perspective is that it really seems like they're going to be leaning heavily on these 2 tight end sets. Basically, every time we saw the top offensive unit, we saw Hunter Henry and Mike Gesicki both on the field together with Mac Jones. You could say that Gesicki is kind of a pseudo wide receiver, which he is. He's basically a big slot receiver who isn't going to do too many traditional inline tight end things. And the fact that Juju Smith-Schuster was not on the field for all of the spring makes it a little bit complicated to say exactly what that top offense is going to look like. But based on everything we've seen, it seems like 12 personnel, 2 tight ends is really going to be their kind of bread and butter this year under Bill O'Brien, which it was the last time Bill O'Brien was here when they had Rob Gronkowski and Aaron Hernandez playing those roles. And I think a good sign from the spring is that both of those players looked pretty good, very good at times. I'd say Gesicki was one of the standouts of spring practice, showed a really strong connection with Mac Jones. Saw he and Henry both connect on a couple of pretty good deep balls in these last 2 minicamp practices. So it's something that we've been saying, it seems like for 2 or 3 years now, that, the Patriots are going back to this 2 tight end offense. Never really worked out with Jonnu Smith, but now with Gesicki in there and him being a little bit of a different player, that does seem like it's going to be a main focus of this offense.
Yeah, I think, they're never going to be able to replicate what they had with Gronk and Hernandez, but I think this is the best chance they've given themselves to reaching an approximation.
If they get like 70% of Gronk and Hernandez,
but they're not going to get anywhere close to the blocking.
No,
that's the big thing. But I mean, I think if you squint hard enough, you can see Mike Gesicki being sort of like the Patriots' super JV version of Travis Kelce, right? Used in a lot of the same ways. And Hunter Henry is your prototypical big-bodied red zone target for a tight end. I agree with you. I think that really stood out. You wonder how much of that was, they didn't have a lot of receivers on the field for a lot of these practices, so Mac Jones really didn't have a choice but to check down to the tight ends and the running backs a lot. How much was it? They went out there with a plan of we're going to target the tight ends in this practice. That's what we're working on. But regardless, I had some of my friends I was talking to, and they were asking, like, what Patriots players would you be targeting in fantasy drafts other than someone like Ramondre Stevenson? And I think, especially if you're in like a PPR league, I think Mike Gesicki is the one for me. I would pick him over Hunter Henry. And that's not like I think he's a better player. I just think the way he could fit into this offense, he could be a target hog. Now, he has a reputation, not a reputation, it's a fact. He's not a good blocker and not really a willing blocker. So, these OTA practices are tailor-made for him standing out because he's not asked to block. No one's blocking.
And looking at him too, he doesn't really look like a tight end.
No, he
He's
looks
tall
like a big slot
and
receiver.
skinny. Yeah, he doesn't have that kind of bulk that you usually see from a tight end.
Yeah, but he is tall.
Yeah.
So I think he's going to be he could be a very good matchup piece. And I'm trying to remember. I think it was Phil Perry a month or so ago spoke with some NFL coach who told him that he thinks Gesicki is going to be their top sort of matchup piece, and that he has the best chance of being someone who opposing defenses have to game plan for, not because he's as good as someone like Travis Kelce, but because the Patriots could use him in a way that really makes other teams and opposing defenses have to put in some extra work to figure out.
I think the fact that Bill O'Brien does have a long history with Gesicki too is another interesting kind of wrinkle in all of this. He recruited him to Penn State about a decade ago, never actually coached him at Penn State, but now is finally getting an opportunity to do that. So he's clearly been a player that O'Brien has liked for a very long time, going all the way back to high school.
Yeah, there's a lot of connective tissue with the tight ends. It's Bill O'Brien and Will Lying, who's now the tight ends coach, who've been together for a long time. Bill O'Brien recruited Gesicki at Penn State. Hunter Henry was saying that he and Gesicki have had a relationship off the field for a while. Bill Belichick's always loved Hunter Henry, so it's just a lot of connections going on there.
This is something that again, it seems like this is what the Patriots have been trying to build toward for the last couple of years. They spent so much money on Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith a few years ago. I think they wanted to go back to that two tight end offense, especially even last year. They completely got rid of the fullback position, and even then, they still weren't able to make it work. I think a lot of it was because Jonnu Smith just simply didn't work out here for whatever reason that was. But again, now I think this, from what we've seen so far, is going to be kind of their primary offensive look. But there are still some questions about that, because we should get to the wide receiver situation now. The Patriots were very shorthanded at wideout basically all of this spring. Juju Smith-Schuster, still have not seen him practice yet since he's joined the Patriots. He has practiced at least once based on some photos that were released by the team, but 5 practices that were
I haven't
open.
even seen those. I didn't even know that.
They put out one photo when they announced the new numbers. There was one of him wearing the number 7 practice jersey on the field. So he's been on the field at least once.
At least it has to be a setback then.
Yeah, it must have been it was one of the first 2 OTAs in that first week before they opened the doors to reporters. So, and we don't exactly know what he's dealing with.
He did show up real quick on his Instagram story the other day. He went golfing somewhere. I think it was either mini golf or a driving range, and he had a big sleeve on his left leg.
Well, that would make sense.
And I don't know if it was the same. Probably should have tweeted it or something. I don't know if it was the same, if that's the left knee that he banged up in the AFC title game. I don't know if it's the same one. I think that's what Mike Reese reported, is that it's the same injury. But yeah, there was a big black sleeve on his left leg.
Yeah, Mike reported last weekend, I believe, that they're being, quote, cautious with him. And then he noted that he had that injury in the AFC Championship game. But he did come back and play in the Super Bowl. As we've seen, he's been on the field at least once this spring. So seemingly that would suggest that it's some sort of a setback, or maybe maybe he tweaks something and they're just being hyper cautious at this point, saying, all right, we want to completely keep him off the field, just give him time to heal. But I mean, the AFC Championship game was 6 months ago.
If you're wearing a sleeve like out in public like that,
yeah.
I mean, it's, I don't. And if you practiced in one, or supposedly did some sort of practice, and now you're out in public wearing that either tells me there was a setback, or he had some sort of off-season procedure that we don't know about yet. Sometimes we learn about those things much later. We didn't think to ask him when we met with him, because it didn't seem like it was going to be an issue. So now we're not going to talk to him for a while. So we'll just have to wait and see. But it is weird.
Bill Belichick said he was day to day when we spoke to him. I believe that was first day of minicamp, maybe the last OTA. Really no real clarity on his timetable for the start of training camp, but it's worrisome, I would say, because when we talked to him, you mentioned that we got to chat with him. I think it was back in May, before
around the draft.
Yeah, it was around the draft. It was before OTA started. He mentioned that he didn't meet up with Mac Jones at all during the offseason for any of these kind of informal throwing sessions that players have a lot. That's not necessarily problematic in itself. Not all players do that, but the fact that they were not able to work together at all on the field before they both got back to Foxborough, and they really weren't able to train together at all this spring because Juju did not participate in so many of these practices. This is a guy who is expected to replace Jacoby Myers as that go-to guy in the Patriots passing game, that guy that Mac Jones knows where he's going to be on 3rd and 6 and is going to give him that ball. If those guys haven't even really thrown together much at all, that on-field chemistry takes time to develop, that kind of mental bond, mental meld, whatever you want to call it. That just doesn't happen overnight. Obviously, still a long ways to go before the actual season starts, and you can make up some of that ground in training camp. But I go back to, I know you mentioned it the other day, Jonnu Smith's quote last offseason about how much he missed by not attending OTAs when the Patriots signed him. He felt like he was behind when he finally got on the field in training camp. For the Patriots' sake, you hope that doesn't happen with Juju Smith-Schuster, because if he can't become that Jacoby Myers type, even if he doesn't step on the field in week 1 and instantly has that same connection with Jones that Myers did, if that thing takes longer to develop, that's problematic for the Patriots offense, especially if they don't end up going out and getting a DeAndre Hopkins or a player like that. And Juju has to be that number 1 receiver in their receiving core.
Yeah, no, I think it's a significant concern. And, you sort of just have to take their word for it and trust that they're doing the work off the field, so that, when Juju Smith-Schuster does get out there in practice, he knows where he's supposed to be, that's not an issue. The talent, he's talented enough where he should be fine in that regard. But you mentioned sort of the mental aspect of it, getting your timing down. I think people took for granted that when you had Tom Brady here, you could go sign Antonio Brown, and a week later he's like making awesome plays against the Miami Dolphins, and it didn't even matter. Or Josh Gordon, they signed him, and it was that long catch against the Colts a week or two later. I might have that wrong, but either way, you could bring players in, and it didn't take long. I mean, Brady had a reputation for, especially with rookies, that if you didn't do that, put in that work during the offseason, or if you didn't form that connection with you kind of never really had a shot. So there is some of that too, but the reality is that's how it goes most of the time. That with a lot of quarterbacks and a lot of receivers, you need to get that time together, especially for timing. And in an offense like the Patriots, where it looks like they're going to go back more towards what they did when Josh McDaniels was around, maybe some sort of hybrid of, what they were trying to do last year, what Bill O'Brien did at Alabama, what Josh McDaniels ran for years. And if that plays out, then it's still going to be a fairly complex offense. And it's one thing to rep that stuff off the field, but it's another to get on there and be comfortable, so that when you show up, you can execute it. Because the other big part of this is a different conversation, but the Patriots can't afford a slow start with that schedule. So they need all these guys ready to go, playing great football from the beginning. And so they need him out there to start a training.
And it's a different offense, too, than what Juju Smith-Schuster was used to running, both in Pittsburgh and in Kansas City.
3 years for him.
Yeah, we talked to him during that kind of introductory press conference, and he's like, yeah, I feel like I'm back in college. Like, I'm using flashcards. Like, he was talking about how difficult it was for him to kind of grasp the offense. And obviously it's a lot easier to pick things up like that when you can actually get on the field and rep it and kind of go through the motions physically without actually and not just having to kind of rely on flashcards and rely on a playbook and a whiteboard and whatnot. So I think that's going to be a very important hurdle that the Patriots are going to have to get over in training camp, assuming Juju Smith-Schuster is ready and healthy and able to get back on the field and participate fully. But he's not the only receiver that there are some questions about. Tyquan Thornton is another one. He came out in the first open practice, the first open OTA, and he was awesome. He was really every
time we watch him practice, I think he does really well.
He was the standout performer of that practice. He had a lot of days like that last offseason. Then he suffers some sort of an injury. Mike Reese reported it was a soft tissue related injury, and we didn't see him for the rest of the spring. So that was, it was. I don't want to go. Excuse me. I don't want to say fully problematic or anything like that. But this was a guy that is looking to rebound from a rookie season that was pretty underwhelming, in my opinion. He played a lot of football, but really wasn't very involved in the passing game. You see him come out in that first OTA and look the way he did, and you say, all right, wow, maybe Tyquan Thornton is putting something together now. He said he got stronger and a little bit bigger during the offseason. He really seemed to be progressing in the right direction, and then an injury wipes out the rest of his spring. Again, also a guy that can rebound in the summer and training camp if he gets back to full health, but it was a little underwhelming to not see him be able to build on that one practice over the rest of the course of the spring.
Yeah, and I think, he is one of, if not, Mac Jones is probably the biggest X factor on the team, but Tyquan Thornton's right there in the top 3 where, let's just say they don't get DeAndre Hopkins, or let's keep him out of it for right now. If with the group that they have, if they are reasonably healthy, or just sort of follow the trends they've all done in their careers, you know what you're going to get from most of these guys. You know Juju Smith-Schuster is going to be a solid, versatile receiver who doesn't have top-end speed but has more run after the catch ability than Jacoby Myers. You know Devontae Parker is great on 50-50 balls. He's probably going to miss a few games. You know Kendrick Bourne can do a variety of different things. He is quick. He is fast. He's not incredibly fast, but he is one of the more dynamic playmakers in that group. And then I'm forgetting somebody.
Tyquan Thornton.
Oh, Tyquan Thornton. And so, and then maybe a rookie makes the team. Who knows from them? But with Tyquan Thornton, he's the one guy who, if he does hit, if he becomes who they drafted him to be, he takes that offense to a completely different level. And it's easy for us to sit here and be like, well, you can't really bank on that, or we all these kind of things. But he was drafted to do that, and he does have the speed to do that. And the Patriots, one of their main issues on offense the last few years is they don't have enough team speed. And again, Kendrick Bourne does have speed. So does Juju Smith-Schuster, but Tyquan Thornton has that kind of high-end speed that you see from other teams that really are able to do a lot of dangerous things on offense, whether it be Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, some of these other guys. He's the one guy that can provide that. And I do think from what we've seen from him in the one practice this year and the practice last year is he's not just, a go route guy. He can do more things. And so if he takes that next step and he starts to realize some of his potential, this offense goes up to a completely different level, with or without DeAndre Hopkins. If Tyquan Thornton does kind of what he did last year, which is either be injured or not effective or a combination of the two, suddenly you're kind of just dealing with the same offense you had last year. And that, again, that's even if you bring DeAndre Hopkins, because I think he, at this point in his career, is a better version of Devontae Parker. And so I think, Tyquan Thornton is an important player for them.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't need to touch too much on the Hopkins stuff because by the time this is posted, there will probably be some developments. He is visiting the Patriots this week. According to multiple reports, he was scheduled to get to New England on Wednesday night and then meet with the team mostly on Thursday, which is today. I'm sure we will get some sort of update once that meeting is complete. There have been conflicting reports about when he could actually make his decision. There was one that said it was possible or maybe even likely that he would decide this week. And then Ian Rappaport over at NFL Network reported yesterday that he expects DeAndre Hopkins to wait until closer to training camp to sign, kind of weigh all of his options, potentially visit one or two more teams. So we don't really know at this point. We could know, by the time you're listening to this, we could already know that the Patriots are or are not signing DeAndre Hopkins, or it could be another month and a half before there's some resolution to that whole situation.
Yeah, he could wait till training camp, but if the Patriots, maybe with Robert Kraft stepping in, come out and give him what he knows is going to be the best offer, then, I think he'd probably take it. He's here because he's interested. So I think if the Patriots want him, they could get it done this week. If they want to play the long game, they could do that too. I don't know how you feel about this. Maybe I'm a little prisoner of the moment, but I have started to think that they kind of need him. And I also have started to think that, a couple weeks ago when he got released, I thought if they get DeAndre Hopkins, the most logical move is to move on from Devontae Parker. So you could argue Kendrick Bourne too, but I think there's some redundancy with Hopkins and Parker. So I think the most sort of balanced and dynamic pass catching group would be to keep Kendrick Bourne over Parker. But after what we just talked about with Tyquan Thornton being banged up, Juju Smith-Schuster being banged up, just not a lot of great reliable depth at receiver. Maybe you hold on to everybody. Yeah. And that would mean that neither of your rookie wideouts make the team unless they find a role in special teams. But that's okay. They're 6 rounders. But I think you could make the case that even if they get Hopkins, that they really aren't in a position to be getting rid of receivers.
I do think it makes sense to hold on to everybody at least into training camp, at least closer to final cuts, just see what the injury situation looks like. Because, you're going to feel stupid if you cut DeAndre Parker and then Tyquan Thornton gets hurt in camp and misses the first half of the season.
Gets hurt.
Or Hopkins gets hurt. Yeah, or
all
any
these
of
guys
them.
Get hurt.
There's a lot of kind of older injury-prone players in that group. I have been writing for months. I think that this is a move that makes sense for the
you
Patriots.
Started to will this into existence during the Cardinals game last December.
Yeah, during that week before the Cardinals game. I just think it makes sense. It makes sense for what the Patriots need. It makes sense for what the Patriots don't have. And hearing everything that we've heard from DeAndre Hopkins himself these last couple of weeks, I think the Patriots make sense for him too. If he said, man, I really want to win a Super Bowl and I want to play with a superstar quarterback, then you'd say, all right, the Patriots probably aren't a fit for you. But everything that he's said, all of his stated priorities are things that the Patriots can fill. the stable management, the quarterback that loves football, the great defense. Add to that the fact that they have the salary cap space to pay him. Probably not the salary cap space to give him an Odell Beckham contract, but I don't think he's going to get that regardless. It seems that getting a strong contract and joining a kind of situation that he likes is more important to him than taking a pay cut to go chase a Super Bowl. So I think that it's a deal that makes sense for both sides. And then from a subsequent roster move perspective, I think keeping everybody in that group through training camp makes sense from a insurance perspective. The only thing is, if they feel like they need to clear some salary cap space, then I could see them making that move more quickly, because if you cut Devontae Parker, immediately clears, I think it's $6.2 million from their salary cap, no dead money attached to that. Obviously, you probably don't really want to cut a guy a year after you traded a third-round pick for him, but
maybe package Devontae Parker and Trent Brown in a deal.
True. I mean, yeah, if you trade him, then it has the same effect. And with Kendrick Bourne, if you trade or cut him, it's $5.5 million off your salary cap, with about 1.5 left over in dead money. So if you need to find a way to quickly clear about $5 to $6 million in salary cap space, cutting or trading either of those players, one of whom will probably get cut eventually down the line, that's a way to do it.
Yeah, or there are many ways to do it. You can extend, restructure contracts, extend guys. There are a lot of ways to do it. Matthew Judon extension seems like a logical place for them to go this summer in terms of some of that roster salary cap management. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it works out. But something tells me we're not going to know by the end of the week, but here's hoping we get something.
I just said we weren't going to spend much time on DeAndre Hopkins. We just spent about 10 minutes talking about DeAndre Hopkins. But it is the biggest news in Patriots world right now. But let's shift over to some of the players that we saw on an NFL field for the first time these last couple of weeks. Patriots rookies, they had a 12-man draft class that they brought in this year. Plus, was it 4 undrafted free agents? 5 undrafted? I think it was 4 undrafted free agents. And I would say the 2 that stood out most were 2 of their top 3 picks. That was Christian Gonzalez and Marte Mapu. Both of them had pretty sizable defensive roles in OTAs and minicamp. I'd say if you're projecting things out right now, Christian Gonzalez looks like their CB1, their number 1 cornerback, certainly a starter. At this stage, obviously a long way to go.
Jack Jones did replace him with the top defense towards the end of the last practice, though. I believe,
did.
Which might have just been like a reward for Jack Jones. But
I would say it was Jonathan Jones, Christian Gonzalez, and Jack Jones were kind of the top 3 cornerbacks really throughout most of the practices we were able to see. In most of them, it was Gonzalez starting and then either Jack Jones or Jonathan Jones. I feel like they rotated a little bit more.
It also looked like they were managing Jonathan Jones.
Yeah, Jonathan Jones didn't have the largest workload in these practices.
Neither did Marcus Jones.
Neither did Marcus Jones.
It's kind of hard to tell.
He worked his way back up. I feel like he was closer to full go by the end of it. But again, I don't think you should write his name in there in Sharpie on the depth chart. But if you're talking about, is this guy going to be a day 1 starter, it seems to be trending that way, I would say. I think the most likely setup there is Christian Gonzalez at 1 cornerback and then Jack Jones or Jonathan Jones at the other one. I think the ideal setup would be Christian Gonzalez, Jack Jones on the outside, Jonathan Jones back in the slot. We saw a little bit of that in minicamp. The Patriots were mixing and matching a lot of different players in the secondary, so a little bit difficult to predict exactly what it's going to look like. But I think you have to come out of these practices encouraged by Christian Gonzalez. He still has a long way to go. He hasn't gone up against kind of fully padded physical practices, and I know that is a little bit of a concern with his skill set. But from everything we've seen from him so far, he looks tall, he looks fast, he looks fluid, he looks athletic. I think he really showed everything that he could in these practices to be pretty encouraged by that first-round pick.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he looked the part, right? That's like the most I think I can say at this point is that he looks the part, because again, it's not exactly real football right now, but
you can't be like, oh, his run defense is great, because you haven't seen anything like that yet.
Yeah, I mean, he looked really good, and I think the Patriots want him to be the day 1 starter. I think Bill Belichick doesn't guarantee anybody anything, so I think maybe that's what that Jack Jones cameo was the other day. Like, hey, Christian Gonzalez, you're not just like anointed the number one cornerback.
Yeah.
And Jack Jones, you've done well this spring after everything that happened last year. Like, we haven't forgotten about you. But I don't really know how to like explain this, but there's also like a vibe, a portion of this. And, one of the, Christian Gonzalez slipped in the draft for a reason or for reasons, and it seems like most of them are centered around, is he a willing tackler? Is he physical enough? And not necessarily makeup, not like immaturity issues or off-field problems, but, he's very quiet. He's very soft-spoken. He's very young. He's 20. He's going to be 21 in a couple weeks, I think. And it seemed like, at least from a lot of the reports or some of the draft analysis that you would see, it was teams were wondering, like, does he have that alpha dog in him, that you kind of want in a top corner, whether that's someone like Sauce Gardner, who came in last year and had a ton of confidence, both on the field and at the podium. You're not really getting that from Christian Gonzalez. It's just not the way he is. But that's not to say that he needs to be that way. There are different kinds of players. There's, different kinds of personalities. Stephon Gilmore was quiet, a different kind of quiet. He had his own version of cockiness. But he was a quieter player. And so just being up close to Christian Gonzalez this week and being up close to Marte Mapu, who I know we'll probably talk about in a second, I came away from those thinking, one guy, it just exudes a lot of confidence. Seems like he's really going places in Marte Mapu, and Christian Gonzalez just seems really, really young. That doesn't mean he's a bad player or that he's not going to work out, but it does make me wonder, hey, if he comes out against A.J. Brown in week 1 and gets smoked, how does he handle that? How does he recover from that? Does he have the confidence to, the mentality you need to have in a top cornerback, which is forget about it, on to the next play? It's a lot to ask from a 20-year-old coming into the NFL. And so, again, I don't want to read too much into just, meeting with a guy in a media scrum, but it was one of my top takeaways is, one guy seems, young and, you can tell he's just getting the NFL, and the other guy, Mapu, seemed like he's already been here for a couple of years.
Yeah. Important to remember, too, Mapu's 3 years older than Christian Gonzalez, which is, most of the Patriots draft picks in the last couple of years have been 22, 23, 24-year-old guys. Mapu is 23. Gonzalez is young. He as you mentioned, he doesn't turn 21 until later this summer. I think it's either later this month or next month. So he's going to be 21 when his NFL career starts. And you definitely didn't get that like kind of alpha dog swagger from him. But I have a hard time viewing that as too much of an issue right now.
Especially because there are a lot of guys like that on the defense anyway.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
and there's like, I covered Stephon Gilmore when he was here for 3 or 4 years. Stephon Gilmore had some sneaky swagger. When you talk to him after games, he was more than willing to throw out some trash talk. But every time you talk to Stephon Gilmore during the week, he was quiet. He was soft-spoken. According to all his teammates, he was basically like that in the locker room too. He wasn't a guy that was going around kind of jumping up and down and hyping people up. And he was the best cornerback in football for a year or two there. So
right, they're not all built like Ty Law or Jalen Ramsey.
Yeah.
They don't have to be like that. But I think teams do prioritize. I think teams would prefer that they are like that.
Yeah.
Because, cornerback's an extremely hard position right now, especially with the way, all the rules for the defense, or the rules preventing defense from really being able to get physical receivers. You need guys that have some brashness to them. You don't need it, but I think teams do prefer it. And it's just, there weren't many knocks on Gonzalez. It seems like that was really the only one, and it's why he slipped to the Patriots.
Yeah, and the fact that there were reports of teams feeling this way about him does make it notable. If those reports weren't out there and he had the press conference that he had, I don't think anybody would really kind of think anything of it. But the fact that there were, correctly or not, there were some teams that thought that way about him, and then that impacted their draft approach, then it is worth noting.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, hey kid, we're killing you because you're too nice.
Yeah.
So it's unfair. But,
if the biggest knock on a guy after his first 5 practices is that
seems
he
like
was
a really nice, humble,
a little
good
bit
kid. Quiet. It's like, wow, you stink. It's not really the best analysis.
But we'll move on to the other one now. Marte Mapu, you mentioned, he's a guy that seems to have really impressed a lot of people, both the media that have been watching him and even his teammates. Hearing Jalen Mills and Matthew Judon and a couple of these other guys talk about Mapu, they're using some pretty high praise. Judon was asked about him, and in his answer he mentioned Jamie Collins and Dante Hightower.
Right.
He didn't say that Mapu was exactly like either of those players, but the fact that he even kind of came to that comparison is notable for a guy who, one, has never played in the NFL, and two, is coming from the FCS, so he didn't even play high-level college football. Jalen Mills said he's the perfect blend of football, of instincts and football IQ. He said he's a very, very smart player. We were able to see some of that on the field. It looks like he was kind of going out and getting some of his teammates into the correct position on some of those plays. For a rookie, it can't be easy to be trying to learn basically sub linebacker and deep safety at the same time. We saw him play both of those in spring practice, and players seem to be excited about what his particular versatility is going to bring to this defense and how kind of unpredictable he can make it. And the Patriots are a team that has seemingly a dozen versatile defenders who can play different positions, whether it's linebackers who can play on the edge, or cornerbacks who can play safety, or safeties who can play linebacker. But multiple players have specifically singled out Mapu as someone who's kind of going to add an extra element of that to this Patriots defense, which I think is certainly notable. I mean, it seems like he's absolutely making an impression inside the locker room already.
Yeah, and I think, why this is so notable, I think, is we're not really, it's all this praise isn't coming from what exactly he's like doing as a player on the field, because he's wearing a non-contact jersey. Again, there's no tackling, there's no pads. We haven't really seen him have to like go out in coverage or do a lot of crazy things. It's all this is really coming from what the Patriots asked him to do over the course of spring practices, which was very atypical. At least the short time that I've been doing this. I know you've been doing it longer, but just from everyone else I've heard or talk about it says, the way they used him as a rookie, the responsibilities they gave him, and like you said, making checks before the plays is very atypical for rookies in a Bill Belichick defense. So I think it's not like we saw him go out and make a bunch of crazy plays like, oh my God, he impacted the game. It was more like, wow, you can tell by the way they use him that they really have big plans for him or high expectations for him. But as Matthew Judon said, like, it's one thing to do in shorts, got to do it once training camp rolls around. But I would say, and this is no knock on Christian Gonzalez, I think, coming out of this, Marte Mapu not only was the most impressive rookie, or the rookie that turned the most heads, but you could say like the number one player overall in that regard. So the fact that he looks like he could factor into replacing Devin McCourty was not really on my spring practice bingo card.
Yeah.
But that's what he was doing, at least sort of.
Yeah, it's going to be really fascinating to see how they actually end up using him. It seems like they're kind of in a trial period where they're saying, all right, let's see if he can do this. Let's see if he can do this. Let's see if he can do this. And that's the way with a lot of players at this time of the year. It's sort of an experimentation period. And then once training camp starts, it'll sort of pare down a little bit. And I think his role will probably be a little bit more defined. But there are some questions about how he's going to be able to handle either of those roles, because his skill set and what he did in college and some of the traits that he has doesn't really project as a replacement for Devin McCourty. He doesn't have some of the same kind of center field safety attributes that McCourty had. But then he's also 6'3", 216 pounds, so he's way, way smaller than any of the linebackers that the Patriots have had if they want him to be a full-time linebacker. So it's going to be really interesting to see where he actually settles in, because there's the jack of all trades, master of none kind of thing, where he can play in all these spots, but is he actually very well suited for any of them? That's something we don't know yet, and we're going to have to see in training camp. But I agree with you. The fact that they're trusting him with all these responsibilities and saying, all right, we think that this guy will be able to attempt to learn all of these things and not be completely overwhelmed and not be able to do any of them. I think that's certainly a positive sign for his development there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I don't really have much else to add. I think, he's, it'll be very fascinating to see what it looks like with him once they come out for training camp. Is he playing with the first team defense? Not even just that, but, because is he getting a lot of action in a sub role as well? And I just, I want to see him hit too. I want to see him in joint practices, no red jersey on, and see what it looks like, because he's another one. They have a lot of these guys now who, he's a missile.
Yeah.
he can really lay some big hits.
He was jacking people up at the Senior Bowl, and he's Yeah, he's a smaller guy, but he can certainly hit. And as you mentioned, the Patriots seem to be just trying to assemble as many almost positionless type players as they can, especially in the secondary. It was really interesting talking to Jabril Peppers the other day. I believe it was after the final minicamp practice. And he was talking about, or we were asking about replacing Devin McCourty. How is that going to work? Because we saw 5 or 6 different players slot into McCourty's old spot during these spring practices. And he said, McCourty is a great player. We're certainly going to miss him. His communication, his leadership is definitely going to be something that we have to replace. But he was almost saying that losing McCourty could be a benefit to them in a way, or it could have a silver lining at the very least, because he was saying with Devin McCourty, he had some versatility too, but 80-90% of the time you knew where he was going to be. You can look out at that defense and say, all right, there's Devin McCourty. He's the free safety. This is what the defense is going to look like around him. Now, whoever is going to be replacing Devin McCourty, we don't know who that is yet, is going to be a player with the ability to play at multiple different positions as well. And whoever is in there at strong safety is going to be somebody who can also play free safety, and probably one of their cornerbacks can also play free safety. And it sounds like, based on what Peppers was saying, that one of their goals this year defensively is to just throw as many kind of versatile defensive backs onto the field at the same time and ask the opposing offense to say, all right, cool, tell me who is playing outside cornerback on this play and who's playing slot corner, who's playing free safety, and then have the ability to change that all around with the same personnel basically right before the snap. And I think that's an exciting kind of possibility for this defense. Again, you do get a little bit into the jack of all trades, master of none kind of thing, where if you don't have that one guy who can replace everything that Devin McCourty was able to do. But I don't know. What are your, coming out of these practices, what are your kind of expectations for this defense? Does this look like an elite defense, a defense that can kind of take the steps to a level that they weren't able to reach last year?
Here's where I am with the Patriots defense, and this kind of dawned on me the other day, where the main criticism of them over the last few years, and I've had it as well, is, you know, they put up good numbers against bad quarterbacks. They look really good against bad teams. And then when you go up against the Josh Allens of the world, just some of the other better offenses, it sort of falls apart and they get exposed for a lack of team speed. Especially, you know, on the second level, the linebackers, and then in the back end, they haven't been able to cover some of these elite receivers, and that was true again last year with Jonathan Jones as your top cornerback. But even still with that, I thought, you know, they did better against the Bills last year than they had the previous couple of seasons. You could argue that the Bills in those games really could have done whatever they wanted, but regardless, I've kind of reached this point where I'm like, what else do people want from the Patriots defense? I don't know. Like, I have a hard time saying now, like, oh, what are you going to do against, how are you going to cover against the better offenses in the league? Because I'm like, who does stop the Chiefs? Who does stop the Philadelphia Eagles? Who limits those teams to 20 points? And some teams, had success against the Buffalo Bills. I would argue that the Buffalo Bills weren't as good on offense last year as many people thought they were. They kind of got exposed at the end for being limited beyond just Stephon Diggs. You know, not many people are going out there and stopping the Cincinnati Bengals. It just doesn't happen. Not in today's NFL. Those teams are going to score their points. And I think the Patriots last year did a good enough job of limiting those teams and keeping the scores down. It's just the offense wasn't able to pull its weight and do its job. And I expect this defense to be even better, because, and especially on the back end, because just across the board, you know, you have Kyle Duggar, who is a borderline sort of Pro Bowl caliber safety. Jabril Peppers, who I think by the end of last season really came on as a good role player. He hits really hard. Adrian Phillips, solid. We talked about Mapu. We talked about Gonzalez. You know, you've invested draft capital, free agency money, extensions on key cornerbacks, key safeties. Jonathan Jones got a good contract extension this summer, or this winter rather. And Jack Jones looked like a potential at least number 2 cornerback last year. Marcus Jones looks like he could be, you know, he's small, we'll have to see, but has the skill set to be a starting slot corner in this league. You know, they've done a lot there. So I don't know. I have a hard time still criticizing them or saying, well, I expect them to go in this year and just get smoked by good offenses again. I think that's unfair. I think they really shored up the run defense for the most part last year. The fact that Lawrence Guy is holding out is concerning, but he's kind of nearing the end of the rope anyway. You need Christian Barmore to you know, have a breakout season this year. The big concern still for me is at linebacker. Juwan Bentley is okay. Beyond that, I don't trust Mac Wilson. Jelani Tavai is more of a depth player. But again, I just don't see many holes on this defense. A lot of people want to criticize them and say they're only good against bad teams, but they're bad against good teams. I don't buy that. I think they'll be a lot better this year. And as I was saying before, I think they have a lot of attitude on this defense from Barmore, Peppers, Kyle Duggar, Jack Jones.
It's a ton of confidence.
Ton of swagger, ton of confidence. I think they have a lot of belief there. So I think they're going to be one of the best defenses in football. And if they go out and give up 27 points to the Philadelphia Eagles in week 1, I don't think that means they stink. I mean, I think the other teams are good. So.
Yeah, this is a team that finished third in the NFL in defensive DVOA last year. So they were one of the better defenses overall, regardless, even though they did have some struggles, as you mentioned, against some of those better offenses. I think that's why Gonzalez, if he plays like a first-round pick, I don't think he needs to step in and immediately be an all-pro, which I think that's unfair to expect from any rookie. But if he steps in and is that kind of tall that the Patriots didn't really have last year, that you can match up against a Stephon Diggs, so that they're not going to see him again this season. But A.J. Brown, as you mentioned earlier, if he can play that role, I think that fills a significant void that they didn't really have on last year's team, and I think it can even kind of elevate the potential of this defense. So he's certainly going to be an important player, and it looks like the Patriots plan to give him a big role quite early.
Yeah, they have enough depth at that position, I think, to bring him along somewhat slowly.
Yeah.
You don't want to bring him along too slowly, and again, you need to get out to a good start, but they have enough between Jonathan Jones, Jack Jones, and some of the other guys to, if he has some up and down performances early, they can withstand it, I think.
Yeah, he doesn't have to play every snap of every game. I think they're going to be basically at every spot in the secondary. They do have the depth to do some pretty frequent rotations and get a lot of different players in there. We're going to close out here with some rapid fire, just some overall impressions from the spring, looking forward quickly to the summer. One winner, one loser from OTAs and minicamp combined. We'll start with winner. Who you got for winner?
We talked about it earlier. I think Gesicki. I don't know if this is like sort of a straw man take, but it feels like maybe he's getting overlooked or underrated as an off-season acquisition. I'm not saying, again, that he's an amazing tight end or he's going to transform this offense, but I just think, a year from now we could look back and go, he wound up being, one of their most productive pass catchers. And he had a good spring, so I think he was a clear winner for me.
Yeah, coming off a down season, wasn't really a fit for Mike McDaniel's offense down in Miami, but 2021, 73 catches, 780 yards, only 2 touchdowns that year, but he's been a red zone threat throughout his career. I think he's definitely somebody that is going to play a very large role in this Patriots offense. For me, for winners, I'm going to go with someone that we touched on but didn't really touch on in depth, and that's Jack Jones. He's coming off the really rough end to a pretty impressive rookie season. He had the injury in the Arizona game, I believe it was, in December. Seemed to be minor at the time, ended up being season-ending. Then he ended up getting suspended by the team. Bill Belichick didn't really want to say much about that in the couple of times he was asked about it. But Jones was back on the field this spring, appeared to be a full participant, rather. Was mixing in with that top unit. As I mentioned earlier, it seemed like he, Gonzalez, and John Jones were those top 3 cornerbacks for most of the practices. And especially in minicamp, he was just around the ball a lot. He had 4 or 5 pass breakups. He had a really impressive interception in that final practice, kind of came off of his assignment and undercut a deep route by Hunter Henry, made a leaping pick. I think we didn't get a chance to talk to him at all this spring, but based on his performance, he seems like a guy who's motivated to put the unfortunate end to his last season behind him. And this was a guy that we were talking about midway through the year as a potential future Pro Bowler. He was playing kind of at that level on that track before things kind of went awry at the end of the year. So I think if he can regain that and sort of stay on the straight and narrow and keep on the program and avoid any of these kind of off the field issues, I think he's someone that people may be overlooking a little bit and could be a very important player for their secondary.
Yep, I agree. For my loser, I will go Kayshon Boutte. I think he already was a long shot to make the roster as a 6th-round pick, receiver out of LSU who has all the talent in the world, was a first-round prospect a couple years ago, had a bad injury in his second season, I believe, struggled on the field, has immaturity, coachability concerns, all this kind of stuff that caused his stock to plummet. So he needed a great spring, didn't have it. We only, I think, saw him in 1 practice, maybe 2.
I think he practiced fully once and was limited another time. I want to say,
and then was a no-show in
Yeah.
minicamp. So he couldn't get on the field, which was a concern. We're not allowed to give specifics, but there was one day where he got quite a talking to from Bill O'Brien.
Yeah.
Kind of freaked out on him during an early practice drill. So you were worried about injuries with him. You were worried about was he going to come in and be comfortable and pick up the offense. Seemed like there were issues with that in both regards. Not unusual for a rookie, but he needed a good spring. And he didn't have it.
Yeah, really kind of a nightmare scenario for Kayshon Boutte this spring. I honestly wasn't particularly impressed with any of the kind of roster hopeful wide receivers. I think Demario Douglas had a good practice right at the start of the spring. Then I don't know if he was dealing with an injury or something. I feel like we just didn't see him at all for the final 3 or 4 practices. He was there. He was present. He was participating in some of the special teams drills, but I feel like we just didn't see him on the field much during those 11-on-11s, didn't make much of an impact.
I also just can't keep track of all the guys wearing like 60, 61, 62. So I couldn't.
It'll be nice.
For me.
It'll be nice for them to get some actual real numbers. Malik Cunningham too is also in that group. He's a fascinating player because he's switching over from quarterback, trying to play wide receiver for the first time ever in his life. We had a pretty good media scrum with him the other day where he was pretty open and honest. He was just like, hey, I'm doing this all off of pure athleticism. I've never run a route in my entire life. Going to be an interesting guy to watch in training camp as that continues, but he seems to have a long way to go in that transition. So yeah, there were some opportunities this spring for some of those younger wideouts to get playing time with Mac Jones. One of the practices that we saw, there was no Parker, no Bourne, no Smith-Schuster, and no Thornton. The available wide receivers that they had that day had played a grand total of 1 offensive snap at the NFL level, and none of them were really able to fully distinguish themselves. So I'm going to see if any of those guys can make a roster push this summer. My loser, we don't need to get too deep into him. We talked about him before, Juju Smith-Schuster. He's a guy you wanted to see on the field. You wanted to see building that connection with Mac Jones, and it just hasn't been able to happen so far. So for the Patriots' sake, they got to hope that he is back to full health and good to go by the time training camp starts in late July. And we'll obviously have plenty of coverage before that happens. But who's one under-the-radar player you're going to be watching once training camp starts up? We talk a lot about the high draft picks, about the kind of marquee free agents, about the starters. But who's one guy that hasn't been discussed all that often that you're going to have your eye on this summer?
Someone that we haven't mentioned, I would say Scotty Washington, the tight end / receiver. I just think, the third tight end is an open spot right now. It's kind of between him, Matt Sokol, Johnny Lumpkin, who was the undrafted free agent, and then Anthony Ferkser, who was a free agent signing, I think, a couple weeks ago. None of those guys are amazing or anything, but there is an opening there. And Scotty Washington has the athleticism to be an interesting player. Jury's out on whether or not he can block, but Devin McCourty tweeted, I think it was yesterday, he was responding to someone and said, Scotty can play. Made some really good plays on scout team last year. Just sort of gave him an endorsement, which kind of came out of nowhere. So I'm interested to see how he does, if he sort of makes any separation in that position battle. And then the other one would be Josh Bledsoe, the third-year safety, former 6th-round pick. Didn't play a lot the last 2 years. Coaches clearly love him, so do his teammates. You just wonder if there's room for him now in this still crowded safety room. But he's got versatility. He's got speed. He can play slot. He can play either safety spot. So he's an interesting player, and I think they like to keep him around. But it's a numbers game, so I'll be looking to see if he really goes out there and earns a job this summer.
Yeah, we haven't even mentioned that Jalen Mills is now playing safety
right.
this spring. So there are a ton of bodies in that position group. So it's going to be interesting to see if Bledsoe can stick around. And from the tight end spot, the Patriots have only kept 2 tight ends for the last couple of years. But if you're going to lean really heavily on 2 tight end sets, you imagine they'll probably have a third one on the roster. And then it's going to come down to really what they prefer from that spot, because they got 2 kind of receiving focused guys in Washington and Ferkser, and then they have 2 more blocking focused guys in Matt Sokol and Johnny Lumpkin, who is gigantic. He looks like an offensive tackle out there, and not just because he's wearing number 65.
Yeah, first time I saw him, I said, "Who is that?" And then it turned out to be Johnny.
He's
Lumpkin.
a very large man. My under-the-radar player, we haven't talked at all about running backs in this episode, but Pierre Strong, he's a guy who didn't play a lot as a rookie last year, really only played on special teams. I think he had something like 10 carries and a couple of catches late in the year. made some plays in training camp, saw some time with Mac Jones in the top offense. He looked fluid in the passing game, which is really the only kind of area you can judge players on in these practices, since they're not allowed to hit. It's not full pads. You can't really say much of anything about how a player runs, but it's going to be really interesting to see how that backfield depth shakes out, because they already cut James Robinson, signed him in March, looked like a guy who could potentially be that new Damian Harris. He lasted about 3 months, reportedly just couldn't get healthy and stay on the field. So essentially now it's Ty Montgomery, who's played both running back and wide receiver this spring. It's Strong, it's Kevin Harris, and it's J.J. Taylor. We'll see if they maybe add another body to that group at some point this summer. Right? Dalvin Cook's out there, or Ezekiel Elliott's out there, Kareem Hunt, Leonard Fournette. There are about 10 notable name running backs still available. So if you're looking anywhere on the roster, maybe they can add a kind of a midsummer signing. That might be a spot for it. But I think there's reason to be optimistic about Pierre Strong based on what we've seen so far. We'll see how he holds up once the pads come on. But there's a spot to be had there. They need better running back depth. They need a reliable number 2 behind Ramondre Stevenson. We'll see if he's someone that can take over that.
Yeah. The only other thing I would add to that is, this is a conversation for another day, but the running back contract value of running backs and how teams pay them is a big storyline around the NFL right now with Austin Eckler, Saquon Barkley, and other players. You wonder where all this is going to end, or how all this is going to go with Ramondre Stevenson. Yep. He's going into year 3. He won't hit free agency until after the 2024 season, but you just never know. Where do the Patriots fall on that? Do they look at him as someone who's an exception to that rule, or do they, to your point, does someone like Pierre Strong or Kevin Harris emerge to make someone like Ramondre Stevenson expendable? I last offseason was saying, maybe they should trade Damian Harris. I understood the argument against it because they needed a good backup for Ramondre Stevenson. But a year from now, maybe we'll be looking at, do you trade Ramondre Stevenson? I'm not trying to trade Ramondre Stevenson today. I'm just, the running back thing is a sidebar in the NFL right now, and he's one of the best in the game, so it's worth talking about at some point.
Yeah, and it is not uncommon.
Strong and Harris play into it, obviously.
Yeah, it's not uncommon, too, for Patriots rookie running backs to essentially be redshirted in their first season and then take on much larger roles in year 2 and down the line. So will be interesting to see what we see from Strong and Harris this summer. I think that'll do it. Any final thoughts before we head off into the summer? You're not going to see much in the way of Patriots coverage from either of us for the next 4 or 5 weeks, obviously, unless there's a DeAndre Hopkins signing. But yeah, we still don't have the exact dates for training camp. It'll probably be, if I had to guess, the 26th or 27th of July. Probably a pretty dead zone until then. But any final thoughts before we go into the summer?
No, I'm worried about opening up a can of worms here, but I will say, because we didn't touch on it, as far as the quarterback competition, there wasn't really one. Mac Jones was, I think, the clear starter. However, I would add that I do think things could change in a hurry if Mac Jones struggles in training camp. I don't think the Patriots would hesitate to give Bailey Zappi at least a chance with the ones to, how do you look with them? Yeah. So, there wasn't really anything that happened during spring practices that made you go, yeah, there's a real quarterback battle here. But I just, I'm not totally filing it away yet. I think I didn't cover the Patriots, the Cam Newtons, or the first Mac Jones summer. You did all that, but I just remember reading reports all spring and summer that there's no quarterback competition here. It's Cam Newton, until it wasn't at the very end. It seemed like it flipped there, and it seemed like the Patriots left breadcrumbs, and then at the end, Mac Jones got the opportunity, partly because of Cam Newton's doing when he had to take those 2 days off. But I'm just saying, it wasn't anything in the spring that made you think Mac Jones' job is in jeopardy, but I'm also not totally putting this storyline away. We'll see.
There was a little bit of a shift, too, in the rep distribution in minicamp. You saw Bailey Zappi get a round with the first-round offense on Monday, and then got another round with the first-round offense on Tuesday, with Mac Jones working with the second offense after that.
Might have been situational.
Could have been situational. Could have been a situation where you say, oh, our starter gets hurt, Bailey, you're in, kind of simulating an injury or something like that. I know that's something that Mike Reese mentioned as a possibility. So maybe that was the case. Maybe it was just that the Patriots offense didn't look all that great against the defense that day and wanted to mix things up a little bit. But yeah, I would say going into training camp, Mac Jones is the clear starter at this point.
Yep.
Will a competition materialize at some point? That remains to be seen.
Yeah, agreed. Very, very, very lowercase TBD. I'm just not. There's so much smoke this summer with the trade reports, all the talk about Belichick and Jones not being on the same page. I wouldn't say they looked like best friends during these practices or anything.
Yeah.
I don't think I saw them talk once.
Mac Jones was kind of standing very far away from the offense during most of Bailey Zappi's reps. Yeah,
and I'm sorry when Belichick
don't want to be the body language police, but
and when Belichick's being as intentionally vague as he is about this for as long as he has, there's enough reporting to indicate that some people, some players and some coaches do really like Bailey Zappi. So again, I agree with you. Mac Jones, clear starter right now, but I just don't think the thing is set in stone yet. Yep. So we'll see.
And that will do it for this week's edition of the NESN Patriots podcast. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Zach Cox NESN. You can follow Dakota at Dak Randall NESN. You can follow all of our Patriots coverage over at NESN.com, all of our DeAndre Hopkins coverage over at NESN.com, and we will talk to you at the end of July.